Welcome all of you. My name is Syed Arish Ahmed and I am an associate professor at Ramjas College, University of Delhi. I've been teaching political science for more than a decade. I want to begin by thanking Professor Sanjay Bharadwaj for giving me this opportunity, and also I wish to thank JNU HRDC. The topic for my presentation today is human nature and state of nature in the social contract tradition. I will begin by telling you what is the social contract tradition, and then we shall briefly discuss the three major social contractualists, namely Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And in the conclusion, we will try and assess the significance and impact of this tradition and possibly also chart a course of the future development of political philosophy because of the impact of the social contract tradition. So that is very simply the brief plan of my lecture. The social contract tradition is perhaps one of the most important traditions in political theory. In the modern world, because of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, the whole contour of political philosophy changed. And the principal question that the social contract tradition put into perspective was the importance of the legitimacy of the government, and most theorists argue that no government can be legitimate unless it has the consent of the governed. Let me very briefly tell you, and perhaps most of you are aware, that before the rise of the social contract theory in the 17th century, the ruling theory of state was the divine rights theory, which essentially believed that kings have a divine right to rule. And John Locke, a philosopher that we will discuss subsequently, criticized Robert Filmer, and the famous book that Robert Filmer wrote was titled Patriarcha. In Patriarcha, Robert Filmer made the argument that political power is just like the power of a father over his children. Now, Locke criticized this tradition almost like Aristotle and said that political power is distinctly different from familial power, and political power is exercised over equals, whereas familial power, or the power that flows in the family, is based on hierarchies. The social contract tradition played a very important role in the transition of the world from medieval political philosophy, which was not just archaic, but also feudal, and it was based on status of the individual, to a modern secular democracy based on achievement and not status. The social contract tradition, as most of you would agree, is also very important for the rise of liberalism directly, and also in subsequent years, in subsequent centuries, for the rootedness of democracy. I don't have to take too many names here. All of us are familiar with the importance of Rousseau and the huge role that he played in the French Revolution. But let us begin from the beginning. The story of the social contract perhaps begins in the Renaissance. And although not in a very organized fashion, we find certain elements of it in the writings of Machiavelli, the great Italian philosopher. Machiavelli was the first thinker in modern times, of course, to argue precisely that human nature is selfish. And although he did not develop a very systematic theory, his deep insights were based on his powers of imagination, and he believed that being selfish is not sinful. He also argued that human beings have a right to preserve themselves, and one of his famous quotes, which I'm absolutely certain all of you have heard, is that human beings forget the death of their father much more readily than the loss of their patrimony. So there is a rise of this new tradition of acquisitiveness, of worldly goods that Machiavelli brings to the fore, glory and gain become important, and this was a far cry from the medieval political thought which emphasized afterlife, the hereafter, salvation. So with Machiavelli begins this very important tradition. And as the title of my presentation suggests, today we are going to focus specially on the idea, or let's say the conceptions of human nature and the state of nature in the writings of the three most important social contractualists. Why did I talk about Machiavelli? I did so because it is very well known that Thomas Hobbes, the first great social contractualist, was actually someone who took the deep insights of Machiavelli and put it in a proper theoretical framework. Before I launch into the three major social contractualists, let me also tell, and perhaps you already know, but still it is important to make note of this, that the idea of social contract was not entirely unknown in the world of antiquity. Whether you look at the West, Greek thinkers, for example, Plato in his Republic, talks about the social contract, where the interlocutors, the characters in the dialogue, especially Glaucon and Thrasymachus, discuss this idea in seed form, especially in the context of their debate on justice. Coming to India, in the Atharva Veda, you have anecdotal evidence that there is a semblance of an idea of social contract, especially in the context of the Matsya, where the big fish eats the small fish, and so on and so forth. And the whole idea of power and might is right is very well known to Indian thinkers and philosophers as well. The principal idea of the social contract, if I were to put it in brief, is that the state is the result of an agreement amongst individuals. It is not natural and it is not organic. Now, all of us know that for the longest time, especially Greek political thinkers thought that the state is a natural entity, and it was conceived as an organism, alive, and individuals were thought to be limbs and eyes and ears and other parts of the body. The modern political philosophy, especially after the Renaissance, completely reverses this idea, and it is based on the belief that state is not natural, it is artificial. To quote Thomas Hobbes, who in his famous words says that the state is the product of human will and artifice. So state is not natural, but it is made by agreement or convention. And the idea of agreement and convention presupposes the consent of the people. So that is the big difference. Now let me come specifically to Thomas Hobbes, who lived from 1588 to 1679. There are many ways to talk about Thomas Hobbes, but let me begin by suggesting, although it is not a certain fact, but there have been speculations as to whether he believed in God at all and whether he was an atheist or not. I bring this on the table simply because if you look at his most important work, the work that made him famous, the Leviathan, which was published in 1651, for which many subsequent writers have claimed that perhaps it is the greatest book ever written in the English language on political theory, the Leviathan is devoted very much to religious subjects, and 2/3 of the book deals with biblical metaphors and parables, and yet Thomas Hobbes is very clever in utilizing old language, old metaphors, old symbolism of the Bible and completely rework its original meaning. The most important contribution that Thomas Hobbes made was that, as I've already mentioned, so I wouldn't go into details here, he systematized Machiavelli, but his own point of view was that man is a machine. He thought about the universe as a machine, And in those days, in the 17th century, this was the heyday of science, of mechanistic theories. This was the age of Galileo and Newton, and Hobbes was very much influenced in his methodology by these great scientists. So we have an entirely different worldview in Hobbes, where human beings are understood as machines, where the cosmos or the universe is understood as a machine, and where even the body politic, the state, is merely understood as a product of human will and artifice. Hobbes had a very peculiar methodology. It had a three-tiered structure. On the bottom was nothing but moving matter. According to Hobbes, everything in the universe could be explained by motion and matter. So even though in the Leviathan he devotes 2/3 of the book discussing God and Bible, but when it comes to the operative parts of his philosophy, he essentially talks only about matter and motion. So on the bottom of the pyramid, you have physics of matter and motion, and the second tier is of psychology, where Thomas Hobbes essentially is quite ambitious, and he claims to have derived human behavior from moving matter. And in brief, he says that human behavior is based upon two fundamental motives: desire and aversion. And according to Hobbes, this explains the entire pattern of how human beings act and in what manner they act. Finally, the third tier in the Hobbesian system of knowledge is of politics. And politics is therefore derived from human motives of desire and aversion. So that is the big claim that Hobbes makes. He may not be very successful in his claims, but at least his methodology is entirely different from how thinkers thought about politics and the state in medieval times. If I bring your attention to another very important feature of Hobbes and his abiding contribution to political theory, this is his mechanization of the idea of natural law. Please remember, throughout the ages, natural law was understood as a fundamental principle which was teleological in nature, and it told human beings their final end or their final destination. For example, for Greeks, the natural law essentially meant that the purpose of human life is virtue, it is happiness. For medieval thinkers, including thinkers like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, the natural law meant that the purpose of human life is salvation or union with God or the afterlife. So the way in which natural law was understood for entire ages, ancient and medieval, was to understand it as a self-evident principle that told human beings about their final destination. Hobbes reverses this. Hobbesian natural law is first of all not organic, and secondly, it is based not on the ends or the final destination of human beings, but essentially it talks about the possibility of life itself. So it deals with the beginnings and not with the ends. If you look at the Leviathan, you will find that the most well-discussed chapter, the most famous chapter from the entire work is chapter 13, which ties up with the title of my presentation because it deals with the state of nature and human nature. Natural law for Thomas Hobbes essentially meant the possibility of life, as I explained a little while ago, but if we expand it a little more, it translates into the principle of self-preservation. According to Thomas Hobbes, every individual has the right to preserve his own life or her own life, and this natural right of self-preservation also implies that every individual has an absolute right to everything and everyone in the state of nature, especially in the absence of any political power or authority. Chapter 13 is important because it brings to fore a very important principle of modern political theory, which is human equality. Hobbes is able to conclusively argue that all human beings are equal. He, of course, adds a rider to that statement by saying that all human beings are more or less equal. And in operative terms, this means that every individual has equal ability. Hobbes tells us that whether it be our mental powers, our mental faculties, or our physical strength, human beings are more or less equal. And the simple, and I might add artful answer that he had for this was to argue that even the weakest man can kill the strongest man. If not by sheer physical strength, then by use of cunning or a weapon or some device or contrivance. So the state of nature in Hobbes is a state where everyone is more or less equal, and therefore everyone has equal ability. But please consider this for a moment. What happens when you have equal ability? When you have equal ability, you also have equal hope of obtaining resources that are critical to your survival. And if people have equal hope, then mutual distrust is bound to happen. Hobbes calls this mutual diffidence, and this is the condition of war. Please remember, for Hobbes, war is not always the condition of actual fighting. But war is the condition where human beings are absolutely ready to settle disputes by a proclivity towards violence. Hobbes famously argues, and perhaps this is one statement of his that maybe everyone has heard, even though you might not be a student of political theory. Life of man, and I quote, life of man is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short in the state of nature. So the state of nature is governed by fear. In another famous statement of Hobbes, he actually claims that fear and I were born twins. I don't wish to go into the details of the attack of the Spanish Armada and the premature birth of Hobbes, but you get the point. Fear of sudden and violent death is the defining condition in the Hobbesian state of nature. When we have this notion of the state of nature, it is not difficult to understand the kind of perception Thomas Hobbes would have about human nature. According to Hobbes, human beings are selfish, they are amoral beings. However, they are rational, that is a fundamental assumption. And Hobbes says that human beings have a lust for power that seizeth only in death. Why are human beings amoral? That is a difficult question, but it must be answered. According to Hobbes, in the state of nature and in the absence of political authority, there is no law. And according to Hobbes, if there is no law, then there can be no justice or injustice, there can be no good or bad. Hobbes believed in the empirical understanding of man, and he believed that human passions make us relative, and we desire what is good for our self-preservation, and we are averse to what is bad for our self-preservation. So good and bad, right and wrong, essentially become relativistic in the writings of Hobbes and also in the writings of subsequent political philosophers who follow him. What is the solution that Hobbes has to offer? Hobbes believes that the defining solution is to be found in the reason and passions of men. Not just reason, but also passions of men. Reason helps us understand the fundamental law of nature. Hobbes gives us a huge list, an elaborate list of how many laws of nature there are. But specifically, the first law is important, which propels human beings, and it enjoins all human beings to strive for peace as far as possible. So we use reason to discover these laws of nature, but it is our passion, it's our fear of sudden and violent death that also helps us in contracting out of the state of nature. And When the contract eventually happens, and I will not go into the details of the contract, that is not our brief for this lecture, but very briefly in a single line, when the contract happens, it happens on the assumption that everyone surrenders all the rights, including the right over everything, natural liberties that one enjoys in the state of nature, and all these rights are transferred to the sovereign. And the sovereign, therefore, in Hobbes becomes absolutist. Now let us come to the other major social contractualist, John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704. Locke was a devout Christian, and no such suspicions can be raised against him. In his writings, he frequently takes recourse to theological arguments. He is important for a variety of reasons, but before we get to his theory of human nature and the state of nature, let me just briefly point out that Hobbes is renowned and acknowledged as the father of modern empiricism. His contributions to the field of epistemology are path-breaking, and it was because of John Locke that the French Revolution actually started a century later. There was a book that John Locke wrote, an essay concerning human understanding, which had a profound impact on later thinkers and philosophers. In terms of his politics, Locke supported the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which actually settled the principle in England that the king must be held accountable and the parliament is sovereign. That was settled in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the era of constitutional monarchy begins from 1688. I must also point out a very important fact about John Locke, which is that in his epistemology, he is an empiricist. However, it is interesting to note that in his political theory, he is a supporter of natural rights. Now, this is a glaring inconsistency, and perhaps Locke was very conscious about it, but he did nothing to resolve it. His theory of knowledge basically said that experience is the source of all knowledge, and he used a very interesting word, tabula rasa, which essentially means a blank slate, tabula rasa in Latin, which means a blank slate, to tell us that our mind is a blank slate and our experiences write on it. However, and also this meant that there could be no innate ideas. So in his epistemology, Locke rejected innate ideas. However, in his political theory, we all know that Locke is remembered for his theory of natural rights, and his theory of natural rights rests on a certain conception of natural law, which obviously is self-evident and does not require any proof. So I wanted to point that out before we move ahead and look at his idea of nature, his idea of human nature rather, and his conception of the state of nature. Hobbes believes that God created human beings in his own image, and because of that, every human being is equal, because every human being has a bit of divine in him or her. So that was the fundamental argument that Locke had for human equality. But please remember, Locke has no issues with a rational explanation. He actually says in his most important book, which is the two treatises on civil government, which was published in 1689, he says that whether you look from the perspective of revelation, which meant the Bible, or you look from the perspective of reason, human beings are equal, and all human beings enjoy what Locke calls as natural rights. These natural rights are famously life, liberty, and estate. Chapter 5 of the second treatise on civil government is perhaps very widely discussed and very well known. This is where Hobbes comes up with the concept that all value is created by labor. The labor theory of value finds a place and a mention here, And most importantly, Hobbes also believed that the ownership of the self is the root of all ownership and property. We own ourselves in the beginning, and because everything that we do with our bodies or with our mental energies is nothing but an extension of our personality. So therefore, by virtue of that, we create property. John Locke believed that human nature is essentially good, man is rational, man is moral. Now here there's a slight difference. In Hobbes, man is amoral. There is no possibility of morality in absence of law. Whereas in Locke, in the state of nature, man is supposedly moral and he is good. And therefore, it is not difficult to infer the idea that Locke had about the state of nature. It was, according to Locke, a state of mutual peace, goodwill, and happiness. Now, unlike Hobbes, Locke also believed that natural laws bind in foro externo as well as in foro interno. What this means is that human beings, because they are rational beings, they are bound morally to obey the natural law, which means that they have to make sure that the natural rights enjoyed by individuals are not curtailed. And natural laws also bind in foro externo, which meant that it is not just a moral obligation, but if anyone breaches or subverts natural laws, then other individuals who are equally sovereign can punish the breaching party. So again, this is a slight difference between Hobbes and Locke. Natural laws bind not just morally, but also otherwise in Locke. So what is the problem in the Lockean state of nature then? According to Locke, there's just one problem. Otherwise, it's a state of happiness, mutual assistance, cooperation, and goodwill, except for one very critical thing that is missing, and that is the absence of an impartial judge in the state of nature. Without political authority, without any government, there is no impartial judge in the state of nature, and people therefore have to be the judge of their own cases in the state of nature. And you can imagine, if people are the judge of their own cases, it definitely means that they will be biased and they will not be able to dispense justice properly. So Locke essentially says that property disputes degenerate the state of nature. Slowly and eventually, it begins as a state of happiness and goodwill, but once property disputes start arising, slowly and over a period of time, the state of nature degenerates into the Hobbesian state of war. So ultimately, the state of nature, even in Locke, comes to that tipping point where something will have to give. Contracting out of the state of nature in the case of John Locke is much simpler, in the sense that natural rights, according to John Locke, are inalienable. That is what makes us human. And therefore they can never be surrendered. And therefore what is surrendered is the power or the right that every individual has to be the judge of his or her own case. So we only partially surrender this right. We surrender this right to the community as a whole, and this constitutes what John Locke calls civil power. Now, let me very briefly, in just a minute or two, explain the difference between Hobbes and Locke on this specific point. The context is important, and I will not go into details, but very briefly, the context for Thomas Hobbes was the English Civil War. It was a bloody period in England, and the purpose of his social contract theory was largely to demonstrate the life of human beings in absence of political authority. Because the trade-off was between fear, sudden death, and the very possibility of life, it is not too difficult to imagine that the Hobbesian individual in the state of nature would have just one goal, and that goal would be self-preservation. So sacrificing all his or her rights for gaining the security that the sovereign provides is a non-issue. In the case of Locke, the context is slightly different. Locke comes a little after Thomas Hobbes. England is not facing any bloodthirsty war. There is general prosperity and peace in England. And Hobbes, therefore, has a conception of the state of nature which reflects this. And that is why Lockean social contract is partial. It creates the community or the civil society, and later on, the secondary contract creates the government. The important thing to note here is that in Locke, the government is only limited. Locke is perhaps the most important votary of constitutionalism and limited government. The third and finally, perhaps the most important social contractualist is Rousseau, who lived in France from 1712 to 1778. Rousseau is often characterized as a modern Prometheus. He was characterized as a modern Prometheus because, just like the Greek legend, Prometheus, who stole the secret of fire from gods and gave it to human beings, creating progress in human civilization, Rousseau is also supposed to have kindled the fire of progress and democracy amongst human beings. I've already told you that he was the intellectual father of the French Revolution. His contributions are absolutely seminal. And along with Voltaire and Diderot, he was someone who played a very important role in the ushering in of the French Revolution. Rousseau can also be understood in terms of his contributions to the ideology of nationalism and the doctrine of popular sovereignty. It is important to point out that Rousseau does not believe, like other Enlightenment thinkers, Kant, to give you an example, he does not believe in the human race or in the idea of humanity as one universal concept. Rousseau believed that communities are organic and they are linked together on the principles of race, history, language, and a shared culture. So he was not a cosmopolitan by any stretch of the imagination, but his writings gave an impetus to the ideology of nationalism because he revived the culture of reverence and obedience, and his rebellion against reason, which is what Rousseau is perhaps best remembered for. He had the courage of going against the dominant tide of the times, which is what Enlightenment was, where every important thinker was celebrating reason. Rousseau had the gumption to say that reason is not the solution to all our problems. Rousseau begins in a very dramatic fashion by suggesting that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And much of his political philosophy is devoted to interrogating why that was so. And in doing so, Rousseau obviously criticizes his own civilization, the understanding of reason and enlightenment and progress. And he wrote a very famous essay that made him a household name in France. This was his first discourse on the sciences and morality. Now, Rousseau believes that man is neither rational nor moral. And we must understand this clearly because he does not accept the Hobbesian or the Lockean point of view that man is rational by nature. According to Rousseau, human beings were like savages or beasts in the state of nature. They did not possess language, they did not possess reason, therefore. But Rousseau does concede that man is essentially good. And this goodness is distinct from morality. This goodness is intrinsic, it is like ingrained in the very nature of man. Man, according to Rousseau, lived in idyllic bliss in the state of nature. And Rousseau, unlike Hobbes and Locke, believes that the state of nature perhaps is not static but evolutionary. There is a certain conjectural history or a certain anthropological point of view that Rousseau has regarding the state of nature. So we begin with absolute noble savages. But according to Rousseau, accidents of history, calamities bring human beings together. And because of that, human beings no longer live solitary lives, but they huddle together for safety and security, which propels them to develop language, and therefore they learn reason at a certain later point in their history. And with the emergence of property, with the emergence of reason, man, according to Rousseau, loses his inner innocence. And much of Rousseau's writing, especially his important book, The Social Contract, it bears the title Social Contract, is devoted to recovering this lost innocence. Human beings, according to Rousseau, are not rational, but they only have what he calls as a sense of natural pity. And this sense of natural pity, or this sense of, as he puts it, amour de soi, which means self-love, is the foundational element of human nature. Everything else, according to Rousseau, is conventional and constructed. Rousseau also believes that there are many stages of the state of nature. And as I told you, once human beings come together, they, of course, discover property, they start living in families, which is the first natural society, according to Rousseau. And then, of course, there is further progress because of discovery of metallurgy and agriculture. But at the end, towards the end of this long drawn-out process, the state of nature in Rousseau also faces the same dilemma, which is that property disputes begin to arise. And because of these disputes, there is mine and thine, and then there is, over a period of time, there is war, and there are many other problems very similar to the Hobbesian state of nature. According to Rousseau, the contracting out of the state of nature happens because there is a very fundamental need to recover what Rousseau calls as freedom or liberty. And that liberty is only possible in Rousseau if it is in sync with the true nature of man. The whole criticism of Rousseau, of Enlightenment, and of Hobbes and Locke was to suggest that human beings are not inherently selfish, but they are made selfish because of the competitive, atomized understanding of human beings. And Rousseau wishes to reverse that. He proudly proclaims in the opening passages of the Social Contract that his political theory is about searching for a political organization where individuals can unite with all, and at the same time, they also have complete freedom as they had before. Now, finally, I must emphasize on one very, very important difference between Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Unlike the other two social contractualists, Rousseau believes that human nature is not fixed. It is not an abstract conception which is mathematical and therefore same and universal everywhere. But Rousseau believes that human nature has the ability to progress. There is a certain perfectibility that is possible. And that connects Rousseau to classical thought, to the thought of Plato and Aristotle, where achieving one's full potential is possible because human beings slowly and slowly, given the right conditions and given the right kind of political organization, achieve that aim. And all of this is crystallized in the very important, perhaps the greatest contribution that Rousseau made to the field of political theory, the concept of general will. We will not go into the details of general will because that obviously is not the brief for our presentation today. But I must tell also, and it is important to suggest that Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau were not the only social contractualists. There were many more who followed. For example, Kant is a very important contributor to the tradition of social contract, And much closer to contemporary times, it was John Rawls who utilized the basic principles of this tradition to develop his own arguments about the original position and so on. The ultimate and the foundational theme of the social contract tradition is the necessity of the consent of the governed, and which is something that opens a window to future development of political theory. And in the writings of thinkers, utilitarian thinkers later on, in the writings of Bentham, for example, and in the writings of many followers of John Locke, many inconsistencies that were inherent in the social contract tradition were removed and they were systematized. And for example, just to give you one example, the theory of natural rights, the idea of natural law was no longer important, and the theory of legal rights supplanted the theory of natural rights. And similarly, the idea of pain and pleasure supplanted the idea of self-preservation, and that is what ushered in the era of democracy. Thank you very much for your patient listening.